And welcome back, everybody. Somebody on this side of the line concerned about his reputation of being late. That's me. So great to have you all back after your coffee or email break. Thanks for joining us again. And this is the last hour, unfortunately, already for today's Charleston in between. No worries, we will continue tomorrow. But here's a really interesting presentation, and I'm very much looking forward what Nandita Quaderi will present to us. Quick introduction. Nandita heads the Web of Science editorial division, the Institute of Scientific Information, which we all know as ISI, I guess, and the Research Professional News team. She has overall responsibility for the editorial strategy, selection of the Web of Science content, and inclusion of journals into the journal citation reports. That makes her a very sought after person in the industry. Nandita joined Clarivate as an accomplished senior publishing executive with a strong research background. Previously, she worked in editorial leadership roles at BMC and Springer Nature and was a principal investigator at King's College. She has a BA in chemistry from the University of Oxford and a PhD in molecular genetics from Imperial College. And Nandita will be speaking on, as you can already see, on how to basically define integrity standards in publishing, I hope with integrity. Over to you, Nandita. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sven, for that introduction, but also thank you, Sven and Leah, for inviting me to share some of the things we're doing at the Web of Science, including some recent policy changes in response to the increasing pollution of the scholarly record that we are seeing. Could we have the next slide, please? So my talk I've divided into 3 bits. The first bit will cover briefly reasons why the scholarly record, the integrity, is under increasing threat. Curtis has covered this really nicely already, but I'd like to have the opportunity to reinforce some of those messages and also expand on them. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about our selection policy for journals in the Web of Science, and finally some recent policy changes in the JCR as well. So if we could skip forward a couple of slides and one more, please. Oh no, back one to the one that, here we are, lovely. So what's happening? Why are we seeing so much fraudulent behavior now? There's always been a degree of fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. This has been around for hundreds of years, and as individual bad actors have tried to gain an unfair advantage. But over the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, we've seen a real uptick in both the quantity and the sophistication of the kind of bad behavior that we're seeing, as well as new types of manipulation. So let's think about this in terms of drivers and facilitators. As Curtis has mentioned, one of the main drivers is that across the globe, there are certain regions where research assessment and reward frameworks are putting undue emphasis on bibliometric indicators rather than expert peer review. So basically, we have a situation where quantity is being valued over quality by just by counting up the number of publications or citations and indicators derived from those. And then what we have then is a situation where these metrics, these indicators, have become a goal in themselves. And as Goodhart's law tells us, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. And that's what we are seeing now. People are chasing more and more publications and more citations as an end to themselves. And what we're also seeing is the misuse of metrics, for example, journal level metrics, that are good metrics to look at a journal, but they're being misused to assess individual articles or individual researchers. So given this increased pressure to publish and be cited, we've got fraudulent enterprises that are exploiting this. And one of the most prominent of those are the paper mills. And again, this pressure to cite and to publish more, it's not just of benefit to researchers. The gold APC OAPC model is also benefiting publishers, but also it's benefiting institutes because they are also trying to increase their rankings to attract students, to attract staff. And so everyone is pushing in this same direction for more, with very little opposing forces and very few disincentives to counter the perverse incentives we have in place. And so I'm not really going to go through the new forms of manipulation and the fraudulent enterprises. I think we are all very much aware of these. I'd just like to say that in terms of generative AI, we're only just beginning to see the effects. So we can see the effects already in a couple of the papers that have been mentioned already, the sort of the infamous rat paper and the ChatGTP prompt that was included in the Elsevier paper. But we're also beginning to see some of the countermeasures, you know, sort of the set a thief to catch a thief approach. So you've got Gen AI promoting fraudulent behavior, but also Gen AI techniques that are helping to detect some of these things. And so with this increasing pollution of the record, we are seeing an increasing need for selectivity and for trust markers. And if we could have the next slide, please. And one more. So again, this takes a village approach. We all have a responsibility to protect research integrity. And in terms of Clarivate, we're not a primary publisher. What we do is provide a second level of scrutiny of what's been published. And our job is to do that well. And we do that by providing 3 levels of curation. We curate our collection. So this is the editorial selection piece, which is what I'll be talking mostly about. And here we have, unlike some other approaches, we have an in-house team of editors that make our editorial decisions. And what's interesting about this approach is our editors, because they're not associated with a particular publishing house or a particular institute, they don't have any conflicts of interest. So they're not sort of subject to any unconscious biases or anything like that. We're publisher neutral, and our policies and selection criteria are all available online. So once the team has decided what goes into Web of Science, and increasingly importantly now, what we remove from the Web of Science, we also have a team that does very careful curation of the data. So we get a certain level of data, metadata from the publishers, and we clean this up and we add to it. And the final level, oops, we seem to have jumped back a slide. If you can go back to the slide we were on. There we are. And the final level of curation we do is to curate our metrics. And if we see metrics that show anomalous behavior, where the metric isn't giving a true representation of the journal, we suppress the GIF. And so basically that's our role in protecting research integrity, particularly the integrity of the scholarly record, is by providing these trusted data sets, metrics, and analytics. And if we can move forward a slide, please. So this is just a really quick introduction to the Web of Science core collection. It contains 6 different indices, 4 of which are journal indices, and that's what I'll be talking about today mostly. So we have the 3 historic indices that are shown at the top, 1 for the sciences, 1 for the social sciences, and 1 for the arts and humanities. So they're abbreviated to SCIE, SSCI, and AHCI. And then we have a more recent multidisciplinary index called ESCI. And so, as the diagram hopefully shows, we have this sort of 2 tiers of indices. And so ESCI is, if you like, the first tier. And entry into ESCI is selective, but it's not competitive. So what we apply here are 24 quality criteria, which I'll show you a bit later, that are designed to look for good publishing behavior, publishing ethics. But we're not looking for high citation activity. So if you have like 1,000 genetics journals, Journal 1001 comes along. It doesn't have to be a high-performing journal to get in. It just has to be trustworthy. So that's the point of ESCI. If you think of it as a sound science journal, it includes things that are right, but not interest at the journal level, not the article level, but not necessarily, you know, the most selective journals that really are going for those most impactful papers. Then we had the 3 discipline-specific journals. And here there is both selection and a level of competitiveness, because here we are looking for the journals in their relevant fields that have the most scholarly impact. And here we apply an additional 4 impact criteria. And mostly we are looking at citations as a proxy for scholarly impact. So once a journal's in the Web of Science, it's not in forever. Journals are subject to periodic re-evaluation using the same criteria we use to initially evaluate a journal. And journals can move between ESCI and the subject-specific indices, subject-specific to ESCI. And if they don't meet our quality criteria, they can be removed from the Web of Science completely. If you could have the next slide, please. So a really quick overview of the journal evaluation process. We have a 4-step process. The first step is an initial triage step, and this is used basically so we can unambiguously identify a journal's identity and who owns it and who's responsible for it. And that's done something called the publisher portal. That's automated. Things that go through the publisher portal then come to the editorial team. And the first step they do is something called editorial triage. And this is to see whether or not a full editorial evaluation is merited. Sometimes we get sent trade journals or journals that fail some of our technical checks, like having certain bits in English as opposed to not. We then go into the full quality evaluation. And this is really the meat of it. So overall, to evaluate a journal takes, I'd say about 15 hours. It takes over a day to do a journal. And most of the effort is spent here. This is when we're really digging into the content of the journal to see if it meets our criteria. And in a broad sense, what we're looking for is alignment. Is the journal doing what it says it's doing? Again, just to emphasize, this isn't competitive. This is just looking for higher standards, high editorial standards in a journal. And then finally, we've got the impact step. And this is the competitive step. And again, as I mentioned, this is to try and identify the most impactful journals in a given field. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So again, this is quite a busy slide. I don't expect you to absorb it all, but it just shows the different steps. So we've got the initial triage, the editorial triage, editorial evaluation in the quality and the impact steps. So you can see in the quality step, I've highlighted 4 of the criteria. And these are the ones where we most commonly see problems. And these are the ones that, we're seeing more and more problems as time goes by. And that's peer review. So we're looking for signs of rigorous peer review. So for example, if we see a journal in biochemistry that's publishing papers on yoga, peer review clearly hasn't happened effectively. Similarly for content relevance, if you're seeing mathematics journals, papers in a history journal, content relevance hasn't worked, and that again goes back to peer review. Author distribution, there's no problem with regional journals, but if we see a journal that's meant to be on Brazilian agricultural policy being flooded by non-agricultural papers from authors that have nothing to do with Brazil, again, that's a problem. That's the journal not doing what it's saying it's doing. And again, appropriate citations. The literature, this goes to the point of everyone's trying to boost citations. And by everyone, I mean self-citation at a personal level, at the level of a journal, the level of a publisher, the level of an institute, the level of a region. We're seeing gaming in all these different dimensions at the moment. If you could go on to the next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, once a journal's in the Web of Science, it isn't necessarily in for life. We regularly reevaluate our journals. And sometimes we've got 22,000 journals. It is like looking for a needle in a haystack. We're very grateful to the community for pointing out when they see things that are improper. We also scan sites such as PubPeer. But what was a game changer for us recently is last January, we introduced a new AI tool that helps the editors much more effectively identify which journals need to be prioritized in terms of reevaluation, because we're seeing signs of concern. This reevaluation is done by the editors using our standard criteria. I mean, last year, there was quite a bit of noise because after introducing this tool, we indexed far more journals, 80-odd journals, than we typically indexed in prior years, because we had this tool to help us find these journals. And a narrative seems to have developed that particular publishers were penalized for being transparent, and these delistings would somehow disencourage publishers to be transparent and hide problematic content under the carpet. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to really emphasize this is not the case. Publishers are not penalized for being transparent, and they're certainly not penalized for retracting articles. Retractions are a really essential way for ensuring the cleanliness of the publication record. Now, we are spending more and more time having to reevaluate index journals. And obviously that is our top priority, to ensure that the Web of Science contains only journals that are trustworthy. And so since 2022, all our focus is on applying the quality evaluation criteria, and we're not doing any impact evaluations at the moment. So what that means is that all journals entering the Web of Science are entering an ESCI, not one of the 3 discipline-specific collections. And we're also not doing impact reevaluations of journals in the ESCI to see if they should move to flagship, or flagship impact evaluations to see if they should move to ESCI. So all our effort is really on protecting this wall of trustworthiness, of publishing integrity, rather than impact. Could we have the next slide, please? So again, so this is just a snapshot of the kind of things that we see with the surveillance tool. So again, just to emphasize, the use of this tool has not supplanted decision-making by our in-house editors. We just use it to help the editors find the sort of needles in the haystack, which journals in the 22,000 journals we index need to be reevaluated. Journals flagged by the tool aren't automatically delisted. They're reviewed by the editors, and if signs of concern are seen, they're evaluated in full against our criteria. And we, of course, are still responsive to the community and customer feedback we value so much. So on the right-hand side of this graph, of this slide rather, we have a couple of examples of journals flagged by the tool, which happen to be true positives, i.e. when we did the human evaluation, these journals were actually removed from the Web of Science. So one of the things, unsurprisingly, that is a bit of a hallmark of a journal that is of concern is a sudden uptick in volume. So this is that top left. Everything we examine is against a benchmark, and that benchmark is the category the journal's in. So we have 250 odd subject categories. You can imagine overall, some categories are going up in volume as certain areas of science are hotter, some categories going down as they're not as hot. So this graph by itself on the left would be is only meaningful when seen against the backdrop of the category. And you can see this category volume has actually gone down at the same time as the volume of this journal has gone up. And this actually was a journal we ended up delisting, as we found a lot of inappropriate content, low quality content in there. The next graph down, again, is an example of geography. So this journal had a very sudden uptick in content from India, whereas that category as a whole, most of the content was from the USA. India was sort of down in the baseline here. In terms of a false positive, excuse me, at the bottom of this slide, we've got a journal that has a very high proportion of content from South Korea, whereas the category as a whole doesn't have much from South Korea at all. But this was a regional journal that included South Korea, Society Journal, and of course, it's absolutely legitimate that such a journal would have a high proportion of content from Korea. If you could see the next slide, please. So I just wanted to expand a bit on the point I made a couple of slides ago about publishers not being penalized for transparency or for issuing retractions. In fact, we really do want to encourage publishers to come to us and share their findings so we can work together with publishers and clean up the record as quickly as possible. So this January, we introduced a new policy to do just that, to encourage publishers to proactively investigate breaches in research integrity and to share their findings with us. So our standard policy is that if any journal fails one or more of our quality criteria, it's delisted, and it's then subject to a 2-year embargo before it's eligible to resubmit for re-entry into the Web of Science. And the reason we have this 2-year embargo is because it does take a long time sometimes for publishers to clean their acts up, but also we want to see a good chunk of content after they've made their changes to really be sure that things have changed. However, times have changed and we are in this era now of much more sophisticated fraud, and sometimes even publishers that really do have good systems in place are being stung. And so we are working together with publishers in a way where if they come to us early and are transparent and can demonstrate to us that they have done everything they can to safeguard the integrity of the scholarly record, and this includes things like issuing editorial expressions of concern and processing retractions as quickly as possible. In these cases, the Web of Science may put the journal on hold, but we could either consider not delisting the journal or reducing the embargo period before the journal can apply to come back into the Web of Science. And if we could have the next slide, please. So this is still a very new policy. We're still working our way through it. And again, I'd like to thank the publishers that came to us last year and were very open with us. And they really helped us create this policy. And this was a mixture of some small society publishers and some larger commercial publishers. So, you know, we've had help and cooperation from both ends of the spectrum. And this policy will apply both when, we've had a bit of slide jumping again. And this policy will, if you can go back to where we were, this policy will apply and again. This policy will apply both when, we need to go forward 2 more slides, please. We were on slide 13. One more. Not sure what's happening here. Here we are. So this policy will apply both when publishers come to us. We've jumped back again. I don't know what's happening. There must be a gremlin in the system. If you can go back to slide 13, please, Leah. Yeah, if you can just stick here for a second. So this policy will apply both when publishers come to us in the absence of prior notification that we are re-evaluating the journal, but also when we have told a publisher that we are investigating their journal, but they really act promptly and help us get to the bottom of what's happening so we can work together to clean things up and get the journal back into the Web of Science once their investigations and their cleanup has is complete. Whatever is shared with us will be subject to verification, but also will be treated confidentially. And details of all of this can be found on our editorial website alongside everything else that I've talked about so far today. And if you could go on to the next slide, please. So if anyone does want to know more, we conduct open house sessions, which are webinars when we go through our processes once a quarter. There's actually one tomorrow, if anyone wants to sign up, and it doesn't clash with the second half of this meeting. But also we do have a recording available that you can watch at your leisure if you are so inclined. If you could have the next slide, please. And one more. Here we are. So now we're sort of moving on to the JCR, so the Journal Citation Reports. I think most of you are familiar with. It's a sister product to the Web of Science, and it's effectively a journal intelligence tool. So it takes all the article level that we have indexed in the Web of Science, and it rolls that up into journal level metrics and insights. So we've made some important changes over the last few years to the JCR. And the overall aim of these changes is to provide more data and more transparency, to have better alignment between coverage in the Web of Science and coverage in the JCR, to level the playing field as we see more and more content coming from the developing research economies, not just the Western world. And finally, to adapt the journal impact factor, the GIF, so it's not just an indicator of scholarly impact, it's also an indicator of trustworthiness at the journal level. So these changes happened a few years ago now, back in 2021, and this is when we first added journals from the Arts and Humanities Index and the Emerging Sources Index into the Web of Science. And we also, in that year, introduced a new journal indicator called the Journal Citation Indicator. So the AHCI journals and the ESCI journals got this new indicator, the JCI, but they didn't get the GIF. And the JCI works quite nicely alongside the GIF because unlike the GIF, the JCI is field normalized. What that means is that fields that are, so each discipline has very different levels of citation activity and different speeds of citation activity. And in general, the arts and humanities citations are lower and slower than those in the sciences and the social sciences. So by comparing the GIF of journals in the arts and humanities, the sciences, it's not necessarily comparing apples to apples because the citation norms are so different. The JCI is field normalized. So if you look at the JCI of the journal and it's 1, it's basically saying that that journal's citation activity is average for that field, whatever that field may be. If it's 2, it's twice the average. If it's 0.5, it's half the average. So again, it makes it much easier to compare journals across different fields. So that's what we did in 2021. 2022, we had a bit of a break, let this bed in. Then in last year's JCR release, we extended the GIF, so it now covers the ESCI and the AHCI journals, as well as the science and social science journals, where it's always been present. And the other big change we made last year is to change the display of the GIF from 3 decimal places to 1 decimal place. And I'll explain why we did this in a moment. This year's release will build on these changes. And what we're going to do now is include the ESCI journals in the GIF rankings. So last year they got a GIF, but they weren't included in the rankings. And again, in a couple of slides' time, I'll explain why we've done this in steps. So if we could have the next slide, please. So let's start with the GIF. So the GIF has been around since 1975. And back then, there wasn't really much need of an indicator of trustworthiness. We didn't see the problems with publishing integrity and research integrity we see now. What we did see, and remember this was the pre-digital age, is the community feeling a sense of information overload. And there was a need for an indicator that helped people recognize what were the sort of must-read journals. And that's what the GIF was designed to do, to look at the most impactful journals. However, indicators of trustworthiness are becoming more and more needed as the scholarly record becomes increasingly polluted. So as I mentioned earlier, the Web of Science, we have 4 journal indices. And until last year, only 2 of these got a GIF. And these were journals in the Science Citation Index Expanded, SCIE, and the Social Sciences Index, SSCI. So although the Arts and Humanities Index and the ESCI Index contain trustworthy journals, these journals didn't have a GIF. And the GIF over time had become a proxy for journal quality, not just for journal trustworthiness, not just for journal impact. And this was causing confusion. And so it made sense to us to give these other journals a GIF as well. So the GIF now really is an indicator of trustworthiness. So having a GIF in itself is an indicator of trustworthiness, and the numerical value of the GIF continues to be an indicator of journal impact. And so by expanding the GIF to AHCI and ESCI, we added the GIF to almost 9,000 extra journals from around 3,000 publishers. And this includes a load of journals from the Global South. It's quite hard to measure this actually. So that's why we're saying a minimum of 5% increase, because sometimes even these journals that are embedded in the Global South, they are published by one of the big commercial publishers, say, I don't know, Elsevier, and so they'll look as though they are headquartered in the Netherlands, where in fact they are headquartered in Bangladesh or wherever it may be. So that's where that minimum comes from. And then there's also an 8% increase in the number of gold open access journals that gave a GIF. So again, we're hoping this change will help level the playing field as well for new journals, open access journals, journals from the developing world or with a regional scope that tend to be less highly cited than the sort of broad scope journals that come from the big publishers sometimes. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So let's get into why we didn't introduce the ESCI journals into the GIF rankings last year. So last year we went from displaying the GIF from 3 decimal places to 1 decimal place. And what this has done is created a lot of ties amongst journals. And this was an intentional move because it's a little bit crazy for journals to be judged better than other journals because of a difference in the 3rd decimal point of its GIF. That's just a level of accuracy that is just unfounded. So we've moved the GIF display from 3 decimal places to 1 decimal place. We've created a lot of ties, and that's intentional because we hope this will make people more prone to a more holistic evaluation of journals rather than just basing it on this one metric. So when the GIF was displayed to 3 decimal places, we had very few ties in rank. And therefore, when you looked at a category, the quartiles were very evenly made. So basically, the number of rank positions was equal to the number of quartiles. And each quartile had roughly the same number of journals. If we had a category with 100 journals, each quartile had 25 journals in it. However, by introducing ties in rank, by going to 1 decimal place, the rank positions don't equal the number of journals, and the GIF quartiles aren't evenly sized by either the number of rank positions or by the number of journals. And because we wanted to make this really transparent, we waited until this year's JCR release before adding the ESCI journals to the quartiles, because obviously that in turn will have another effect on the dynamics of these quartiles. If we could have the next slide, please. So this year we are adding ESCI journals to the rankings for our science and social science categories. So there's another change as well. So we've got 9 subject categories that are co-indexed in different editions. So if we were to take psychology as an example, psychology is both in the science index and the social science index. And currently there are 2 separate rankings for psychology. As of this June's JCR release, there will be 1 psychology ranking, including the ESCI journals. And what will be very clear in this year's release as well is that although typically journals in the subject-specific indices have higher GIFs than ESCI journals because they have to pass these additional impact criteria as well, there are some ESCI journals that will have a higher GIF that are in the top quartile. And there's two reasons for this. The first reason is that getting into one of the discipline-specific journals isn't purely determined by a journal's GIF at a given moment in time. It's application of the 4 impact criteria. But also, if you remember, we've not been doing impact evaluations for a couple of years. But overall, we believe that creation of these combined rankings will provide a much easier, a much more complete category view than lots of separate rankings for each category. And one more slide, please. What we're not doing this year is introducing GIF category rankings for the arts and humanities. Last year, we did intend to do so, but we've really taken a deep dive into the data now and had extensive consultations with stakeholders from across the community. And again, because of the citation behavior in the arts and humanities, remember, citations are lower and slower than in the sciences or the social sciences, the modeling shows us that if we were to introduce GIF rankings, they would be incredibly skewed because we would have these massive ties in rank, sort of tens of journals, sometimes even 100 journals have the same rank, which would give completely meaningless results in terms of rankings and in quartiles. And therefore, we're not going to be introducing rankings, GIF rankings for the arts and humanities. And the appropriate way to compare and rank these journals is still using that field normalized metric we have called the JCI. And then the last slide, please. So that's, I realize, a lot to take in. So a quick summary. So now all the journals in the Web of Science have a GIF, which is now displayed to 1 decimal point, not 3. The GIF has become much more inclusive. We've added another 9,000 journals, but it's still a very selective metric because only 20% of journals that apply to get into the Web of Science actually enter. So 80% of journals do not meet our non-competitive quality criteria. I think, again, that gives us a sense of how much stuff is out there that really does need to be taken with a pinch of salt. And then we're creating the combined category rankings that will include the ESCI journals. The impact of this is simplification, more data, more journal and publisher representation, and the GIF now being used as an indicator of trustworthiness at the journal level as well as of scholarly impact. And the benefits for our customers is that they see increasing value by seeing more data. It helps the community as a whole perform deeper journal analysis and make more informed decisions. And finally, it does support the integrity, publishing integrity, the integrity of the publishing record by providing much more transparency and by prioritizing the quality criteria, trustworthiness, over the impact criteria. And then I just have a final slide that has some additional reading on it if anyone has the desire to learn a bit more. Just remains me to say thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Nandita. That was great. And I have 2 remarks and 1 quick question before we open it. First of all, I think it was really great that you reminded us how important retractions are as an essential way to really keep the scholarly record clean, and that it is not a sign of failure for publishers per se, right? But
Absolutely.
that you really have to look at the retraction itself, so that we don't lose those details. And secondly, it seems to me that what you guys are showing in your developments over the last years is really an arms race, if you want, between creating and detecting fraud, more or less. So it seems that you have done a lot of catch up on the technology side over the last years, and I found that really pretty impressive. I have 1 question for you, which is, how do you think we could further incentivize retractions fast retractions? We have seen the bounty programs earlier, but is there something that the publishing ecosystem publishers could do themselves to be more trustworthy? Because I heard a little bit in Curtis's words that there is a kind of element of doubt whether this is being postponed for whatever reason. So what would you do? Is there any kind of best practice how to retract speedy?
I think that's a really great question, Sven. And I think the first thing I'd like to say is that we have a sliding scale of behavior, right? We have a sliding scale of infringements and bad behavior. And we have many different flavors of retractions as well. You know, there are honest mistakes and there's downright fraud. So I think something that the Retraction Watch database does, which is really valuable, is to sort of have a nomenclature for retractions. There's different kinds of retractions. So this will go some way towards destigmatizing retractions. I think that's the main thing. We need to destigmatize retractions. We are sort of in this age of mass retractions now, where I think when we have this case, when a single publisher is retracting tens of thousands of articles, we have to ask what's going wrong. But the correct thing to do once something has gone wrong is to clean things up rather than just stick it under the carpet. So I think retractions should be applauded. There are certain best practice things in the COPE guidelines. It does sometimes make it slower, and COPE is actually looking at its guidelines now to try and expedite retraction. So one of the things we see is in the community is that there is sometimes a reluctance for people to really examine themselves. So, going back to when I was working in publishing, we say a whistleblower would come to us saying, look at this article. We would look at this article and we'd then go to the university saying, can you help us? And we'd be stonewalled. So I think there's a sense of everyone trying to protect their own reputation. So things like United to Act, those kinds of initiatives are really valuable as well in bringing people together, having this sense of shared responsibility, but also not hiding behind shared responsibility. Yes, there is shared responsibility, but different stakeholders have very specific individual responsibilities, and we really need to get behind that. So I think having some changes in the guidelines behind best practice for retractions to allow things to be expedited and taking the stigma away. And again, sort of a sense of different flavors of retractions. I think all of those things will help.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's about shared responsibility and not diluted responsibility.
Yes.
That's why I'm so interested in this term of publishing integrity and not research integrity, which I think Mohammed has explained very nicely is a much broader problem with so many other actors involved that it probably doesn't help us in the conversation of what we are trying to tackle here, right? So I completely agree. Here's a ton of questions for you. Let's get started with Megan McDavid, who says, do you have recommendations or resources for helping editors and editorial office staff make sure their journals meet and continue to meet the quality and impact criteria?
So in terms of recommendations, I mean, the criteria themselves are kind of our guide to best practice. Megan, I would really recommend you try and come or listen to the recording of one of the open house sessions. If you come to one of the sessions, you can ask questions, but it really does sort of go into those criteria in some detail. I mean, if anyone here is from Britain, you'll know a phrase called "does what it says on the tin." It's a brand of paint. That's what we're looking for. We are looking for alignment between what a journal says it's doing and it's actually doing.
Super. Thank you. Romy Beard is asking, does Web of Science listing change publisher practices, i.e. do you see delisted journals come back with stronger peer review, better content relevance, and so on? Also, is there any evidence that journals listed in the Web of Science are not targeted by paper mills?
So the first question, yes, it's really heartening to see journals come back. And in fact, some of the conversations we have with publishers is they share our criteria with their publishing managers internally to say, look, this is what you should be aiming for. So that's really heartening. Web of Science journals are published a lot by paper mills, and this comes back to that incentive framework. Paper mills aren't going to be, journals without an impact factor often aren't attractive to paper mills because of the way researchers are assessed, and they are rewarded for publishing in journals that are either in the Web of Science or other databases or having a GIF. So I would say it's the opposite, that journals in journals and indices are targeted more rather than less than unindexed journals.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably see from the two publishers in the room tomorrow in the second installment of this conference, we'll probably see responses to that as well, because I was really interested in that. Is it like the top journals? Is it the lower impact journals? And it's really interesting if you, not to spoil this, but anyhow, these publishers feel individually very much impacted, probably by different practices. But that's, I think, something that we are trying to work out together tomorrow.
Yeah.
Here's the last question to you, as at least the one that I have by Kaveh again. Do we need a taxonomy for expression of interest, retraction, and correction from publishers? It seems there is no absolute standard.
So yes, we do. And this is one of the things, again, so United to Act, as Curtis mentioned, there are 5 working groups. One of those working groups is about how these things are displayed in how these things are displayed post-publication. So absolutely. The more transparency there is, the better in general.
Super. Yeah, Kaveh, it was clear. He corrected himself, but it got all clear. The answer was pretty clear. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Nandita, thank you so much for joining us today and going through us with the changes that you guys have been initiating over the last few years. I think this was really very helpful and a great final point to basically the 3 presentations we saw today in total. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. Unfortunately, again, sorry that we don't have our anonymous person. We'll endeavor to continue finding some colleagues, a few colleagues for the next round of this. For today, I think we are coming to the end of our program, and we'll see each other tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern. Now I'm confused, Leah. Now I need your help because
9 a.m.
so much
Eastern.
better than me.
Yeah, we'll get started tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern, and a reminder will go out with the agenda for everyone, excuse me, an hour ahead of time from our Zoom function there. So thank you, Sven. Thank you to all of our presenters. It was a wonderful presentation, a great kickoff, great first day. We'll see everybody tomorrow.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.